Hello, my name is Ebert Nevevins, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Nintendo's mascot Mario, his latest doings, and the story of how he got where he is today. They call him Mario. However, you may know him as the famous Brooklyn plumber that rescued Pauline from Donkey Kong during 1981's infamous Manhattan Kong Be Gone outbreak, when teens and provocateurs alike began to huff the popular Gorilla Invasion spray for a cheap, nightmarish buzz. You may also know him from a year later when he got sky high off the stuff himself, ventured into the jungle, and kidnapped Donkey Kong as an act of intoxicated retribution.
In my defense, I was a Kong Begana. I was addicted to busting open those cans with my keys and to slurping up the pink bubblegummy goop that they keep in there. Look, I am not proud of what happened when I kidnapped Donkey Kong, but it's also like really, really addictive.
And toxic?
Toxic? You want to talk to me about toxic? They removed my liver and Nintendo had to get me a little tiny itty bitty Rob the Robot to just filter out the alcohol when I'm drinking because I can't get Kong Begun because it's now a prescription thing.
But what you don't know is that Mario's become a major investment for the folks at Nintendo, a humble toy manufacturer turned legal love hotel manager that's taken a keen interest in exploiting his exploits for arcades.
They really made me look like a palooka in it. They took out some big details that ended up making me look like some sort of dashing hero type when I'm just a guy with a big drug problem that got really pissed off when his girlfriend got kidnapped by a giant gorilla.
What Mario didn't understand was that Nintendo would end up transforming his likeness into a character that would marquee some of the most successful video games of all time. A trend they predict will continue with their latest title, Super Mario Bros. I recently sat down with the game's lead designer, Shigeru Miyamoto, a man some consider a visionary from the future, in order to hear his thoughts on how Super Mario Bros. Came to be. Eventually, we realized that Mario simply wasn't going to get clean and that we should just make a game about that instead. So we did. We followed him throughout the 5 boroughs one night while he was chasing the white horse and wrote down what he told us he was seeing. We then took those notes and combined them with elements from the incoherent ramblings he calls a draft for his memoirs and crafted a game around them about a superpowered plumber who's trying to rescue a princess from a dinosaur. When asked whether or not it was entirely ethical to do that with Mario's life story, Miyamoto held a literal mirror up to our face and asked whether or not this puff piece we were doing about his obvious addiction problems was unethical too, and followed up by asking us whether or not we were just trying to turn Mario into another Judy Garland or Britney Spears. When pressed as to whether or not he was referring to the 4-year-old girl named Britney Spears from Louisiana, Miyamoto then had a sudden nosebleed and started repeating, oh God, it's 1985, oh God," pushed us out of the room the interview was taking place in, and quickly vanished without a trace. Coming up next, a medical study that asks whether or not microwaves are really waving at us, something about Reagan and Star Wars because it's 1985, and a fun, uplifting story about how Gonzo from the Muppet Babies committed homicide during a burglary. Howdy everyone, 'tis I Niche, and frankly, I didn't think this video had to be made. When it comes to seminal 2D platformers, you'd be hard-pressed to find a trilogy of games more impactful and overly discussed online as Super Mario Bros. 1, Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, and Super Mario Bros. 3. Which is why when I sat down to make this video, I thought the best angle I could come up with was simply covering every version of Mario 1. Only when I started researching things, I remembered that the Lost Levels is pretty interesting too, and that it could pair pretty nicely with the Mario 1 review, and I remembered that there was an entirely third Super Mario Bros. Game that nobody ever talks about. Because when you think about those 3 games I just listed, you'll realize that they actually constitute what could be considered the original Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, one that predates Super Mario 2 USA and Super Mario Bros. 3's introduction into the franchise. And doesn't it at least sound like, I don't know, at least a bit interesting? Certainly interesting enough to talk about Super Mario Bros. For the next 55 minutes.
Released in 1985, both here in the US and overseas in Japan, Super Mario Bros. Is a 2D side-scrolling platformer for the NES and Famicom respectively. In it, you play as Mario while pawning his fraternal twin brother Luigi to your younger siblings or friends as they adventure through the Mushroom Kingdom to save the captured Princess Toadstool/Peach from the evil King Koopa or Bowser, depending on where you live. Created by Nintendo EAD's R&D 4 team, the game was directed by Shigeru Miyamoto, who had just finished work on Excitebike and Devil World and was eager to combine the strides in game development that had arisen in those titles, namely their screen scrolling and larger sprite sizes. In fact, the game wasn't even intended to be a Mario game until Takashi Tezuka, who had worked with Miyamoto as designer on Excitebike, Devil World, and Super Mario Bros., suggested that they cast Mario as its leading man. After taking a bit of influence from 1984's Pac-Land, using a ton of graph paper to design the levels, and pushing the Famicom's hardware to its absolute limits, at least until the release of the Famicom Disk System and forthcoming advancements in chip technology had something to say about that, Super Mario Bros. Was released and quickly went on to absolutely floor any and everyone who could get their hands on it. While Mario's earlier games were well beloved and heavily influential in their own right, Super Mario Bros. Represented a seismic leap for video games as a whole, with Computer Entertainer's August 1986 issue saying that Super Mario Bros., quote, belongs in that special hall of fame reserved for truly addictive action games, comma, the kind that keeps you from being on time for supper. The game quickly became the centerpiece of Nintendo's attempt to break into the American market in late 1986 following the North American video game crash in 1983, and by 1988 it would even get split with Duck Hunt onto a single cartridge as the hardware's new North American pack-in game. And from there, the game, Nintendo as a whole in the US, and Super Mario himself would go on to enjoy a meteoric rise in popularity. Super Mario Bros. Would even go on to become the best-selling game of all time for close to 30 years before getting dethroned by EA's mobile and multi-platform version of Tetris, which came out exactly one day before the 20th anniversary of Super Mario Bros.' Japanese release, by the way, and Wii Sports, another game that probably enjoyed that status in large part to being a pack-in title like Super Mario Bros. Since then, we've gotten way too many mainline Mario games and spin-offs to count, a live-action movie that I'll die defending as being the good dumb fun that it is, an animated OVA that got a genuinely gorgeous 4K rescan straight from a 16mm print last year, and several American animated shows with some of the budgetest animation to ever come out of a decade known for its low-budget animation, a friggin' pro wrestler playing Mario in its live-action segments, and a delightfully dated rap theme song that intrusively reminds me of the human beatbox from the Fat Boys every time I hear it.
With the Mario Brothers and plumbing a game, we're not like the others who get all the fame. If you think it's in trouble, you can call us on the double. We're faster than the others, you'll be hooked on the brothers.
But does it hold up? Yeah. Super Mario Bros. Is the first game that I ever played. I've said this story on the channel before, but my mom picked up our NES before I was born back in the early 90s. At the time, she was just a normal nurse at our local hospital who was pregnant with me and didn't have anything else to do, so she ended up buying an NES with Super Mario Bros. From the local Woolworths. You know, before they became Woolworthless in the US at least. Thank you. She'd basically come home from work every day and just stay up playing Super Mario Bros. With her sister until they both got tired and went to bed. And in much the same way that they say playing classical music for a baby tends to nurture its development, allegedly, I like to think that they're playing Super Mario Bros. So much and me being unable to not listen to them because I was an unborn baby probably predisposed me towards loving video games, damaging my eyesight by playing video games, and spending my free time damaging my eyesight night by talking about video games on the internet. What I'm trying to say is that I've literally been playing Super Mario Bros. For my entire life. But in doing that, I'm also acknowledging the fact that by being so familiar with Super Mario Bros., I've probably taken it for granted on some level. Now, I obviously know that Super Mario Bros. Is a great game, but for whatever reason, it's also one that I've never thought of revisiting under a more critical lens. And in spite of the massive influence it's had on pop culture and gaming as a whole, I honestly wouldn't know if I should recommend the game to people who've never played a Mario game before off the top of my head. Because after all these years, it's possible that the biggest thing this game still has going for it is the fact that it was the first one, the Hydrox to every other platformer's Oreos. The genre's come a long way since 1985, and these days, it wouldn't be that outlandish to suggest that Super Mario Bros. Is a bit like the white bread of platformers. Plus, even if I could recommend this game to newcomers, it's been re-released and remade so many times over the years that I'd be hard-pressed to know which version I should suggest. In fact, exploring and ranking every version of Super Mario Bros. Was originally gonna be the crux of this video. I wanted to play every major revision or release of the game in order to figure out how it's changed over the years, as well as to compare and contrast them, and while I will still kinda do that on some level, I ended up uncovering an angle for this video that's just, well, a lot more interesting. Because in looking into every version of this game, I remember that Mario 1 was so popular that Nintendo basically greenlit direct sequels to it that were nothing like the Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3 we canonically consider to be this game's follow-up. In the case of Super Mario Bros. 2, I'm obviously talking about the Lost Levels, but it turns out that there was another Super Mario Bros. Sequel known as Super Mario Bros. Special that was developed by Hudson Soft for the Japanese PCs known as the PC-88 and the Sharp X1. So today, I thought I'd do a deep dive into the history of side-scrolling platformers and explore the original Super Mario Bros. I'll talk about the original release, Super Mario Bros., as well as its more notable remakes, the Japanese exclusive Super Mario Bros. 2, which became known as the Lost Levels overseas, and I'll talk about the rare and under-discussed Super Mario Bros. Special and whether or not the game itself is even worth your time. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What were some of the first video games that you remember playing? Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. On top of that, feel free to subscribe and share this video with your friends or anywhere you see fit if you're enjoying what you see so far, as it goes a long way in helping the channel grow. You can also sub to my Patreon or buy me a coffee if you'd like some bonus goodies and want to support the channel that way too. And with that out of the way, on with the video. Upon booting the game up, you're given the choice of either beginning a 1 or 2 player game, and seeing as I'm alone again, I'll naturally be reviewing the 1 player experience, though they're both identical due to not featuring simultaneous play, with the only exception being the omission of Mario's brother Luigi. As stupid as I'm about to feel explaining the premise of the game, given its ubiquity and popularity, Super Mario Bros. Has you traveling from left to right across 32 stages in order to reach the flagpole at the end of it, or do battle with the King of Koopas Bowser and his 7 doppelgangers before you can rescue Princess Peach. It's a bit like Kill Bill if you were to swap out Uma Thurman for an Italian plumber, martial arts for curb stomping turtles, and for... Besides that though, they're basically peas in a pod. Everything about Super Mario Bros. Is classic. From jumping on enemies to using a Starman, raining hellfire on Bowser with the Fire Flower, or even hopping into some of the game's many pipes, Mario 1 is iconic as all hell for good reason. And once you peer through the looking glass a bit and actually try to savor everything the game has going for it, you'll find that it still feels really good to play. Like, alright, no duh, Super Mario Bros. Is still a hoot and a half to blaze through, but it's really impressive what R&D 64 was able to accomplish with this game, because once you actually pop the hood of this bad boy open, you'll find that Super Mario Bros. Isn't just innovative, it's, well, super innovative.
Yeah, I didn't like that joke either.
It really is true though. For example, while it seems like it wouldn't be anything special for the game's levels to have a blue sky in them, Super Mario Bros. Was actually one of the first games to implement such a feature. Back then, most games just stuck to a simple black background for its levels to keep things simple and as unstimulating as possible for players in dark, dingy arcades. And I know it sounds like a tiny detail, but it really adds quite a bit of flavor to the game by enhancing the cartoony energy of the world with a nice splash of color. Plus, it allowed the devs to actually use the traditional black background in a more creative way by having it represent nighttime in several of the game's levels too. But the details of Super Mario Bros.' innovativeness go way further than that, because as cool of a tidbit as that was, it's still basically just realizing you could use a different colored marker on a piece of paper.
What?
While many may just think of Mario 1 as being a plain Jane when it comes to its gameplay, a statement that isn't entirely wrong by the way, it actually has a bit more nuance than many give it credit for these days. You actually have a lot of control over your movement in the game, such as how you can change the height of your jump based off of how long you hold down the A button, pick up some extra speed by holding B, use that extra speed to execute a further jump, and pull off some fun slides while crouching while you're running. And that's just fun, man. Like, the only way I'll ever do that in real life is if I come to terms with the possibility of blowing my knees out in the process. The relatively simple execution of the game's many ideas feel ever so slightly refreshing these days, given just how far the genre has come in the wake of it. It feels pure and Spartan, unfettered from the need to throw in multiple characters, a world map, a ton of different power-ups, and the stuff we've come to expect from modern platformers. And because the game is so old, we also aren't exactly mad that it isn't here in the first place. Of course, back then though, this did stand out. While platformers have been a thing since 1981's Donkey Kong more or less created the genre, Super Mario Bros. Was the moment when platformers had its coming of age moment. It wasn't the first side-scrolling platformer or anything. That honor actually goes to the 1981 Alpha Denshi title Jump Bug for the Sega Z60 arcade system, but it was the first notable side-scrolling platformer to get a home release. One of the reasons why Super Mario Bros. Represented such a sea change for the industry was due to the sheer replayability of it. It was a touchstone example of a game having a definitive ending where you'd finally rescue Peach at the end of World 8-4. Sure, the game would just restart and throw you in a harder version of the game after that, but it was still the end of your adventure at a time when the vast majority of games were treated more as amusements designed to suck away your time and quarters, and as such were never intended to be over in the same way that Mario 1 was. I mean, look at Pac-Man. Before Mario came along and effectively, he was the face of video games, and yet the final level of his own game was a glitched up mess on account of the hardware it ran on running out of memory.
Is this a happy ending or a sad ending?
It's an ending, that's enough.
Everything just feels like it's there for a reason, and the inclusion of an ending sounds like a no-brainer, but it was probably something that people actually had to sit down and discuss implementing. That level of deliberation runs through everything this game has to offer too. There's a delicate balance to every power-up that's available to you, the construction of the stages, and the secrets that lay hidden within them. To the point where the game's famous infinite one-up trick was actually something that was purposefully inserted into the game. Mario 1 may only have 4 items, but they all fulfill each of the basic needs you'll have as a player. The mushroom and fire flower give you a bit of insurance from losing a life. The fire flower gives you a means to napalm those who stand between you and the endorphins that get released whenever I grab the flagpole at the end of a stage. The Starman's, well, basically power incarnate, and the one-up allows you to get 1 extra life.
And this is God speaking to us through food.
And you got our wedding vows off the internet.
And the secrets. Oh man, the secrets. At the risk of sounding really hyperbolic, the secrets make Super Mario Bros. For me. Being able to collect an extra life by jumping in the right spot, going down a pipe into a bonus room, or straight up skipping chunks of the game with a warp zone is a lot of fun, and it breathes a ton of life into the game's otherwise very samey level designs. Oh yeah, I should probably talk about those right now. Super Mario Bros. Has 5 primary stage types, which are overworld stages, underground ones, athletic stages, underwater levels, and your castles, with each of them having their own music aside from the athletic and overworld stages, which share Super Mario Bros.' iconic overworld theme. However, despite the different stage types, they're all basically the same. I mean, underground stages are a bit different in the sense that you can actually get above the stage and make quick work of it if you want to, and the underwater stages are obviously completely different because of all the water there, but things can always still be approached in the same basic way. Make a beeline for the flag at the end of the stage and get there before time runs out, dodge or attack enemies, and sing along to one of the game's very few songs while you do so. While the water stages are different from normal ones in the sense that the physics are different, they still fall into the same basic formula once you get into the nitty-gritty of them anyway. Now, that sameness doesn't stop the levels from being fun or extremely well balanced and thought out, especially for such an early game in the genre. Rather, it just shows that Super Mario Bros.' biggest problem comes down to the lack of variety that could probably just be attributed to not having the extra space on the cartridge to spice things up. Hell, they could have been running out of space or time when they were working on the game, because it turns out that 5 of its 32 levels are straight up recycled from other parts of the game anyway. And I'm not talking about parts of the stage or anything either. I mean the whole kit and caboodle was lifted straight up and pasted in another part of the game. Also, fun little side tangent incoming, I distinctly remember replaying the water levels on the Game Boy Color version of the game a ton as a kid because, as lame as it sounds, it reminded me of Mario Teaches Typing, which we had on our kindergarten computer, and I never really got to play much of. Now, you might be asking why I just stopped the video in order to tell you guys that, and it's because I was feeling nostalgic and felt like it. I mean, it's a Super Mario Bros. 1 video, you gotta let me be a little nostalgic. Back on topic though, the other break from the usual mechanics found in Mario 1 come in the form of the game's 8 castle stages. They're not that different from the other ones, mind you. You're ultimately still running and jumping after all, since this is a platformer, or as a lot of older game publications in Europe once called them, jump and runs, but they do feature the game's quote-unquote boss battles, if you could even call them that. At the end of each of the castles, all you'll need to do to get past Bowser is reach the switch just past him to drop him into the lava, or hawk several bowls full of hot lava soup into his eyes yourself in order to trigger a cutscene and get to the next level. Aside from in the last castle though, those cutscenes will all be the same and are essentially the NES equivalent of a 60s Batman cliffhanger. Oh, and you're never actually going up against Bowser until the last stage either, but rather imposters that have been created out of normal enemies via magic and just have most of his abilities.
You idiots! These are not them! You've captured their stunt doubles!
However, another thing worth mentioning about these stages is how a couple of them actually involve some puzzle solving. While running through some of these stages, you'll be given multiple paths that'll need to be traversed in the right order in order to progress deeper into the castle. It doesn't make much sense logically, but it's a nice touch that helps the game feel grander and more epic than it would otherwise. But at the same time, it's also really frustrating on account of the NES version of the game doing absolutely nothing to tell you whether or not you've gotten the right sequence down. Thankfully though, that's actually one of the additions that I really appreciated in some of the ports that Super Mario Bros. Has gotten since its NES release. In November of 1990, Nintendo had finally had enough of Sega Jenna pissing all over them with their 16-bit hardware and decided to duct tape 2 NESs together and slap the word Super in front of it. Their new console, the Super NES, or Super Famicom as it was known back in Japan, launched alongside the fourth Super Mario game, Super Mario World, but just a few years later would be graced with full-out remakes of the first 3 games in the series, with both the US and Japanese versions of Super Mario Bros. 2 included for good measure. These remakes would get bundled into what became known as Super Mario Bros. All-Stars, a title that I always interpreted as being a somewhat cheeky reminder that, despite the high-quality competition Mario was facing by 1993, Mario games were the originators and were still a cut above the rest of them. While the version of Super Mario Bros. That's included here has new 16-bit graphics, bug fixes, a save feature, and even some new music though, this is essentially still just Mario 1. Sure, the physics aren't one-to-one and they actually feel a bit slipperier than they did on the NES game, and you can now sprint with the X button if you're a heathen, but things are remarkably similar outside of that. Besides the added chimes to let you know you're completing the castle puzzles correctly, my favorite inclusion to this version was the addition of toad animations at the end of the castle stages. It ain't much, but it adds a lot of character to these levels and makes for a nice incentive to run through each of the game's stages, or not just 5-minute speedrun your way to victory with warp zones. That's all there really is to this version though that I really liked. I mean, stages now have thumbnails before you start them. That's kinda cool, I guess. This one feels a little baity, but I can't say I don't relate to the hustle at least a little bit, so I can't really be that mad about it. Most of the other changes just feel like they were added to take advantage of the hardware's capabilities, which obviously makes sense from a development point of view, but also feels like a minor misrepresentation of what makes Super Mario Bros. Such a fun game. For example, the underground stages are now bathed in a genuinely nice reverb effect, and while that's a nice touch, it feels completely arbitrary because everyone playing the game can already tell they're underground and they didn't need that extra layer of immersion. It's really just more data for our brains to process. I think a game worth comparing to this one would be Halo Anniversary Edition. I won't delve too far into detail about Halo 1's remaster here. Honestly, just go watch Noodle's excellent video on the subject if you're curious for more info on it, but one of the game's biggest issues is that it rewrites an art style that may have showed its age on a technological level, but was still more than serviceable. The Anniversary Edition brought the game's art style up to some semblance of parity with its sequels and where the series was when it was made, but it also sort of betrayed the character that the original had, along with just being horrendously flawed in its own right with new models that don't fit the geometry of old ones, completely ruined lighting, and a bunch of other stuff that, again, please just watch the Noodle video to learn more about. And with Mario 1's All-Star version, I think the same thing is going on thanks to little things like collision when you hit bricks or question blocks feeling different. It may look more visually in line with Super Mario World than the other games offered in the collection, but its gameplay still feels rooted in 1985. There aren't any new power-ups, collectibles, or levels here, it's just Mario 1, albeit with more detail. Still, I don't want to make it sound like it's a bad version of Super Mario Bros. Though. It's perfectly fine for what it is and is worth playing if you can't get a hold of the NES version or just want something a little different. Though I did enjoy the way the night levels looked, and I do kind of wish the bonus room theme was expounded on because it's really catchy. So yeah, it's got that going for it. However, the other remake we got was on the Game Boy Color a couple of years later, and oh boy, is this version something else.
Hello, everybody. Hey, George, come here. I'm gonna tell you what I think. Oh, I know you don't care what I think, but I'm gonna tell you. I think that you are terrific.
Released in 1999, Super Mario Bros. Deluxe is a port of the 1985 game for Nintendo's portable hardware. The game features the original Super Mario Bros., the lost levels under the somewhat patronizing title as Super Mario Bros. For Super players, along with some other goodies that I'll get into in just a little bit. Due to being a remake for the Game Boy Color, the game features some screen crunch, tighter physics and controls presumably to compensate for said screen crunch, and genuinely may be my favorite version of Super Mario Bros. You'd think that the screen crunch would be a bit of a deal breaker since it's usually the kiss of death for a lot of platformers, but it's actually barely an inconvenience given how universally ingrained the level designs of Mario 1 are in everyone's heads, as well as how clear-cut most of its level designs were to begin with. It may cause one or two misjumps if you haven't played the game in a while or just haven't played it ever to begin with, but the game's relative simplicity goes a long way in keeping the action from overwhelming you in spite of that limited screen real estate. As for the tighter controls, they feel fairly minimal in the grand scheme of things. Frankly, I wouldn't have even noticed them to begin with if it wasn't for the fact that I read about their inclusion while I was doing research for this video. They're basically just there to make sure that you can stop Mario a bit more quickly and pull off some trickier maneuvers if an enemy or obstacle catches you off guard, and they accomplish that goal with flying colors. But that isn't why I consider this to be the definitive version of Super Mario Bros. As far as I'm concerned. It's actually because of everything surrounding the game. Deluxe may be one of Nintendo's most thorough re-releases of one of their classic games to date, both earning its title of being the deluxe version of Super Mario Bros. In spades and going down as one of my prized games from my childhood. In conjunction to just straight up including Super Mario Bros. 2 as fun little side content, the game also allows you to play as Luigi whenever you'd want and has tons of extra collectibles. Once you've beaten a stage in Super Mario Bros. Deluxe's original mode, you'll be able to access it from the game's challenge mode, which adds stuff like red coins and even straight up Yoshi eggs for you to find and collect in every level. On top of that, there's even a new You vs. Boo mode that has you running in a head-to-head race against a transparent, unkillable ghost across 8 new levels. And as if it weren't enough, these levels are really well designed too. They're relatively simple in execution, but they have this added switch mechanic that can make them a lot of fun to work your way through. I wouldn't call them edge of your seat difficult or anything, but they're a nice addition, and I genuinely wish we got more levels like them in this game or in other Mario games in general. Rounding this package out even more, we also have a toy box with some neat little mini games and amusements thrown in for good measure too. There isn't much to report on here, but I do think that they're a nice inclusion, and they even feel a bit like a prototype for the minigame collections that some of the DS era Mario games would get. The only real flaw outside of the screen crunch that I mentioned earlier is the fact that the game's colors have been brightened and punched up a bit in order to make up for the lack of a backlit screen on the Game Boy Color. Aside from that though, the game's basically flawless. It's a bit pricey for what it is, I suppose, especially since there are a million cheaper ways to play Mario 1 if you really want to, but it's definitely worth a look sometime in spite of that. Overall, Super Mario Bros. Is a great game, and its relative simplicity and the purity of its intent, coupled with the comparatively low ambitions it had for its design compared to where the genre is these days, makes it a real charmer. On top of that, there aren't really any bad ways to play the game either. It's available on nearly every Nintendo console except the Virtual Boy in some way, shape, or form, and it plays pretty great on all of them too. I was originally gonna talk about the NES Classics version that was released for the Game Boy Advance back in the day and call it the worst version on account of the limited screen space on the GBA and how Nintendo handled squeezing Super Mario Bros. Onto it, but even then, it's still more than playable. I'd definitely just stick to like any of its other re-releases over that one though, if I were you. Alright, so Super Mario Bros. Is as much a crowd pleaser as spinning the Beastie Boys in a Gen X bar in Brooklyn is on weekends, and frankly, I don't think any of us are that shocked to hear it. But what about Super Mario Bros.' direct sequel on the Famicom Disk System? That game came about when Nintendo was porting the original Super Mario Bros. To arcades as Versus Super Mario Bros. And decided to add some new levels to replace the repeated ones. After finishing those levels, the guys over at R&D4 just kind of figured, yeah, okay, let's make another one, and decided to reuse them as well as create a bunch of new ones in the process. Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels were released just a year after its precursor's Japanese release and is more of an expansion pack to that first game than it is a true sequel. It was built on the same engine, reuses some assets, and while it does technically have its own identity, still feels more like an iteration of that first game as opposed to its successor. In fact, it doesn't even swap out any of the music from the first game for new tunes either, and if you're playing the Super Mario Bros. All-Stars version, has even less of an identity due to using the same basic sprite sets from Super Mario Bros.'s remake. The game just feels more like a reworking of the first one, and a bit like the sort of thing the General Computer would have whipped up back in the day with one of their ROM enhancement boards. But as for why Nintendo made this game in the first place, it's obviously because of, well, money.
That's right, folks. Longtime owner Mr. Krabs is opening a new restaurant called the Krusty Krab 2. What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money!
Given the fact that video games as we know them were less than 10 years old at the time though, it's somewhat understandable that Nintendo went this route with the game. Simply put, there just weren't enough video game sequels out there yet to have set a precedent that this game should be anything more than just more Super Mario Bros. With a few twists thrown in for good measure. Unfortunately, those twists would ultimately be the reason why us folks in the West would have to wait till 1993 to play through this game for the first time though, as the game's idea of having a good time was essentially trying to monkey paw you for wanting to play more Super Mario Bros. In the first place. Everything about this game sort of exists as an almost deconstruction of the first game's design, ratcheting up the accessible difficulty to the point of frustration and adding in stuff like poison mushrooms which can actually hurt or kill you, as well as backwards warp zones in order to punish you for wanting to explore the level. It also tweaks some of the in-game physics so that Mario and Luigi have a more substantial bounce when you jump off of enemies, trampolines send you flying into the air like your peers from that episode of Community, and even gives you an incentive to play as Luigi over Mario by giving them different attributes. Attributes that, by the way, are still a part of the character to this day on some level, as playing as Luigi grants you higher jumps in exchange for more slippery controls, and basically serves as the game's hard mode in the process. It's a small change, but it's a nice one on account of making him feel a bit more like his own character as opposed to just being Green Mario. The same can't be said about the game as a whole though, unfortunately. I do think these incremental changes are nice, and I do also believe that Super Mario Bros. 2 does definitely have an identity, but it's just a shame that that identity is so heavily rooted in being in a version of the first game. It's obviously not the only game to ever riff on its predecessors. I mean, I literally made a whole video about how Sonic 3 did the same thing back in November, which also used the same community shot I used a second ago too for good measure, but it kind of feels like that's almost all this game has to offer. It's still a lot of fun, mind you, but I kind of feel like it misses out on what made Super Mario Bros. And a lot of its sequels such great games. You know, their accessibility. Mario games have never been particularly hard, and they have a pretty low barrier of entry. They're perfect for newcomers to video games or younger players because they're easy to pick up and play. The first Super Mario Bros. Came out at a time when most games were still based on trying to get a high score while robbing you blind at your local arcade or pizza shop, and represented a major shift in game design by being a title with a definitive ending that actually wanted you to beat it eventually. It was still gonna try to challenge you and keep you on the edge of your seat, sure, but it was designed to be fair and manageable at the same time. It's a game that's really scant on the scat, if you know what I mean. It's very light on bullshit. Super Mario Bros. 2, however, is the exact opposite of that, and probably owes some of that to its DNA belonging back in the arcades with Versus Super Mario Bros. It's got a ton of close jumps for you to take, enemies all over the place, and the aforementioned poison mushrooms and backwards warp zones. Basically, everything's out for blood this time, and there's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with this being a harder game than the original or anything, but that change alone just doesn't feel substantial enough to warrant it being a full-on sequel to Super Mario Bros.
It's different. Jonah, I feel like you can explain this better than I can.
I know it's different. I'm just having trouble putting into words why.
Taking a step back from just railing on the game though, it does feature some really good ideas. I already mentioned Luigi, so I won't bore you with that stuff again, but it also features 5 extra worlds for you to blaze through once you've beaten the game. And that's just nuts when you think about it. I mean, this game was already kind of a bonus game in its own right, and yet Nintendo just went ahead and threw in close to 2/3 worth of another Mario game at you because there was extra space on the disc. It also doesn't have any duplicate levels, and the tweaked physics are admittedly a lot of fun to play around with. Plus, I do like some of the redesigned sprites for this game. I don't know if they redesigned them in order to make the game look more different from the first game, or if they just, again, had the extra space on the Famicom Disk, but it's nice and it does give the game a bit of its own identity. However, that's all I can really say about Super Mario Bros. 2. Super Mario Bros. For Super Lost Level Players 2 for the Famicom Disk System isn't half bad, it's just really frustrating. While I wasn't a fan of the genuinely insane difficulty for a Mario game, it may just be what some of you guys are looking for, so I can't really knock it either, and I could see it making for a fun double feature when paired with the original game. Personally, I find it more interesting for its historical value than anything, and for the insights it gives us into what made the original Super Mario Bros. Such a special game by deciding not to imitate that design philosophy. Just like with the original game, there are 1.5 million different ways to play Super Mario Bros. 2 these days, and they're all fine for what they are, I guess. If I could pick though, I'd rather just go with the game we got in the US instead, but that's also just a story for another time. And last, but certainly not least, we have Super Mario Bros. Special. This game was developed by Hudson Soft, the company behind, and was released in 1986 for the PC8801 and Sharp X1 Japanese PCs, as well as allegedly got a port a year later for Samsung's SPC 1500 over in South Korea. On the surface, SMB Special looks like another port of the NES game, at least until you actually boot it up and realize that it's an entirely new version of the iconic NES game with 32 exclusive levels in the style and format of the title for you to jump up, superstar to. Because a lot of home computers back in the 80s sucked, for lack of a better term, the game actually didn't have the screen scrolling that made Super Mario Bros. Somewhat revolutionary. Instead, the PC88 version just cuts to black or uses a transition, while the Sharp X1 version has a slide transition that's more or less the same one from The Legend of Zelda on NES. It also features redesigned sprites that spatially match up with the NES counterparts just fine, but makes use of the colors that were available on the hardware the game's running on, adds dithering to some sprites, and straight up changes Mario's default overalls to be yellow over a red shirt and cap. It does kinda look interesting for what it is though, and actually reminded me of his Super Mario Maker getup of all things. Something interesting about Super Mario Bros. Special is that the game runs at different speeds depending on the hardware you're using. While the game runs just fine on the stock 4 MHz hardware of the PC88, it can quickly become a chipmunk nightmare to play if you use the 8 MHz version of the console. And in the case of the Sharp PC, playing at 4 MHz results in the game running as slow as molasses, which is especially bad as it's the only configuration of the hardware that was ever made available. Because of this, the game is borderline unplayable on the X1 when using stock hardware due to how much it chugs. I mean, you can play it this way if you really want to, but just be prepared to die from boredom or something on account of how stiff everything feels. As a frame of reference, imagine if every level in Super Mario Bros. Played like you were in Labyrinth Zone from Sonic 1, and you'd kinda be close to how the game feels at this speed. Actually, it may be even slower than that too. Because of this, I elected to emulate the game at 8 MHz on the Sharp X1 emulator I was using, which speeds the gameplay up to play at roughly the same speed as the NES version. I know it isn't exactly authentic since the Sharp X1 was never that fast to begin with, but well, it also just kinda had to be done. I would've just stuck to the uglier PC88 version of the game for my review, but seeing as I ran into an unpassable glitch halfway through that game, I couldn't really do that much with that specific release to begin with. I think the game was as glitched up as it was due to a bad rip of the game or something, and while I did consider downloading a few other ROMs to see if I could get past that point, the Sharp and PC88 versions are basically one-to-one otherwise, and I didn't feel like dragging my feet through the PC88 version again anyway. The biggest difference between the two are the visuals and basic play speed, so yeah, I mean, I think you get the point there. Plus, I'm not even gonna recommend that you play these versions in the first place, though I'll be getting to that in just a little bit. Even though playing the game at 8 MHz does a lot to improve the experience, I don't want you guys to get the wrong idea and think that it magically fixes the game though, because it really doesn't. For starters, while the basic gameplay and the level timers still work fine for the most part, some of the animations get borked up in the process, with the most obvious of these being the piranha plants who suddenly can't stop chattering their teeth like they fell into a frozen lake or had hot water suddenly stop working while they were in the shower. The game also still runs into quite a bit of slowdown when playing this way too, and the controls feel a bit too unresponsive to be comfortable in a platformer. But while those issues are somewhat minor and could be overlooked, the real big issue that happens when playing the game this way comes in the form of what happens to Super Mario Bros.'s iconic music. Take the series' iconic World 1 Level 1 overworld theme. While the original is a chipper and lively jaunt that took some pretty clear inspiration from the Square's 1980s jazz fusion banger Sister Marion, the game speeds it up so fast that it begins to sound like it belongs in a nightmare sequence from a silent movie. And once the timer drops below 100, well, you may as well just put your controller down, lay on the floor, and let out a singular yelp for help because the itty-bitty musicians in your PC are about to exhaust themselves to death and trying to play it faster for you. That's how video game music works, right? If you absolutely need to play this version of the game, I recommend turning the sound down or something, because while I'd certainly take a decent speed over bad music, I'd also just rather play in silence or to a podcast or something from my watch later on YouTube. Anyway, once you get into the game itself, it actually ain't all too bad. The lack of real-time scrolling is definitely a bummer, especially since it's arguably the innovation that Super Mario Bros. Is synonymous with, but it's still more than playable for the most part. I mean, there'll be the odd section or so where you'll get punished by an enemy or pit that you literally couldn't see coming and stuff, but those moments are just a bit few and far between enough to be tolerable. The coolest thing about this game by far though is that it has new enemies and items for you to use. I didn't find all of the items during my own playthroughs, but in referencing some of the awesome channels and sites that have covered this game before, Super Mario Bros. Special features a clock that adds 100 extra seconds to the timer, the Hudson Bee, which can be collected to gain 8,000 points, a lucky star that clears the screen and basically acts like the POW block from Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, includes the first item that gives Mario the ability to fly and works like the raccoon suit did in Super Mario Bros. 3, as well as straight up has the hammer from Donkey Kong in it too. I'm especially pleased about that because it allows me to recycle a joke from my Donkey Kong 94 review.
Still worthy. Oh boy.
As if that weren't enough, it even features enemies from Mario Bros. Arcade and Donkey Kong, which is especially mind-blowing when you consider the fact that this predates Nintendo's very own efforts to tie together elements from various Mario games and form the visual language for the series as we know it today. That said, the game does have some fairly serious issues though. For starters, the fire bars during castle stages have collision that sometimes breaks entirely, and while it's awesome that there are new items in the game, you also don't get to use them anywhere as much as you'd actually want to. Plus, the same goes for the new enemies, as they don't even show up until the end of the third world, meaning they won't be there for like half of the game. The game's balancing is also only just fine. The stages are well designed, and they do feel mostly in line with what you're expecting, given it being a permutation of Mario 1 and all, but it's a shame that the game's difficulty feels more like a byproduct of the lack of screen scrolling, stiffer delayed controls, and general sluggishness of the software itself as opposed to the level designs. Candidly, while I do find this game to be interesting from a historical perspective, as well as an amusing alternate version of Super Mario Bros. In its own right, that's really the only pretense that I can recommend these two versions under. They're cool and fun, but Super Mario Bros. Special is more intriguing than it is an unearthed masterpiece. Had it not bore the name Super Marionette Clothes, it would have somewhat understandably been forgotten in favor of other PC platformers like the Great Giana Sisters or Commander Keen. However, there actually is a version of Super Mario Bros. Special that I recommend. Not the South Korean one though, because no one can actually confirm whether or not that game really exists or if it's a hoax. I'm actually talking about an excellent ROM hack for the original Super Mario Bros. By Frantic. In 2021, to celebrate Mario's 35th anniversary, the ROM hacker known as Frantic released SMB Special 35th Anniversary Edition, a Super Mario Bros. ROM hack that reconstructs the Hudson Soft PC game to play on NES hardware. And you know what? This version totally slaps. It's literally just Super Mario Bros. Special, but with the original game's engine. In other words, it's exactly what everyone playing the PC game was probably hoping their game would be back in the 80s. It preserves the integrity of that original game, but it makes it more accessible for people who may be curious to experience it, and even maintains all the cool stuff from that version too. It even goes the extra mile and recolors things a bit to make it feel more saturated and chunky, as if it was a PC game from that era. My only gripe with this version of the game is that because it's using the original NES title as a base, some of the jumps can be especially tricky due to NES Mario's jump being a bit lower than his PC counterparts. That said, it's still completely beatable though, even if you do need to sometimes finagle things a bit to get there. I really recommend checking this one out sometime, especially if you're looking for a new way to experience the original Super Mario Bros. If I had to slot it into the double feature idea I suggested in the last chapter, I'd say it fits really comfortably between the two official games. If you play them that way, you can start the night off nice and easy with Super Mario Bros, maybe take a brief break for a meal, return to Super Mario Bros. Special and start to feel the heat a bit when you wiggle your way through some of the less optimized sections, stop for dessert, then hate yourself for choosing ice cream despite your lactose intolerance while you rage at Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. You know, basic Friday night stuff. So, does Super Mario Bros., and by proxy the Lost Levels and Special, hold up? Well, to quote myself at the beginning of this video, yeah. All these years later, the original Super Mario Bros.'s biggest selling factor remains the fact that it's the first one. I know I expressed some concern over that being the game's best selling point for modern newcomers earlier, but it's truly a huge win for the game. There's a genuine thrill to getting to look back at this game in the wake of all that it's inspired and to see and feel the creative sparks that caused such a shockwave in gaming. Despite its age, the game still has it where it counts, and while it won't blow most players' minds anymore, it's still extremely fun and really well made. On top of that, if you haven't played it before or just happen to know a non-gamer that's looking to give the hobby a shot, you can't go wrong with the game that many attribute with quote-unquote saving video games in North America. I went through a ton of ideas for this video when I sat down to make it, but at the core of each of them, I always had the same goal of wanting to look at Super Mario Bros. In a new light. It's often said how after you've been in a relationship for a while, you can sometimes stop noticing the little things about your partner that you fell in love with, and as weird of a comparison as it is to say out loud, I think that somewhat holds true with Super Mario Bros. Too. Now, am I saying that you should go and have a candlelit dinner with your copy of Super Mario Bros? Maybe, if you're into that sort of thing, I guess. And please, if you are and you end up doing that, take a picture of it, post it on Twitter, tag at NichePlays, because that's awesome and hilarious, and I don't know, just good for you, man. But really, what I was talking about was how awesome it was to rekindle my love for the original Super Mario Bros. Because by being a game that's been around for me for my entire life, I almost started to take it for granted. For as long as I've been alive, Super Mario Bros. Has been a piece of video game royalty. People have always held this game in high regard, and for good reason, to the point of its monumental impact on the hobby feeling a bit overplayed in pop culture. I mean, think back to the intro chapter to this video when I was talking about its development. There's a good chance that you at least kinda rolled your eyes at what I was saying because you already knew it. Super Mario Bros. Is just that well documented and appreciated already. But in being that well known and beloved, it's all too easy to take it a bit for granted. Which is why I thought making this video would be a lot of fun, because it wasn't just me engaging with my nostalgia for the series for close to an hour, it was me trying to go beneath the surface to discover why it connected with me, my mother, and millions upon millions of people over the past 3.5 decades. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, you decide to leave an answer to the question of the day over in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and maybe share it with a couple of friends that you think may enjoy it too. Doing stuff like that goes a long way in helping the channel grow, and if you want to go the extra mile, you could also check out my Patreon or buy me a coffee. Subscribers to my Patreon get access to commentary videos for every episode of NichePlays dating back to like last May or so. They get to see an 8 to 10 minute bonus episode that actually came out almost a full year before I made my channel, and you get sneak peeks at future videos, you get to bug me via DMs, and I recently made a react video on my secondary channel that my Patreon subscribers actually got to see a full week early. Whenever I have the time to do fun stuff like that, I'll be sure to put it on Patreon first, so if you want to see it first, there you go. The next video I'll be putting out is about the Toy Story 2 licensed video game for PlayStation 1, N64, Dreamcast, and PC. It's a collectathon that I remember really liking as a kid, and I'm really excited to share that video with you guys in the next month or so. So yeah, bye.